Good morning. How are you? I would love to try something, if you don't mind. Forget everything you thought you knew about Christianity. And I mean that, really. I remember reading something a number of years ago. I think it was in some psychology journal. On a really, really, really good day, we can change 5% of our mind. We can change 5% about how we think about something. That's on a really good day, just 5%. So let's see if we can at least try to challenge you and me to change the way we think at least 2%. You ready? A number of years ago, I bought this book, Echoes of Exodus, Tracing a Biblical Motif. The book of Exodus and its main ideas about the Israelites being in slavery and then being freed because God wanted them freed, and then what happens? The word Exodus and the idea of Exodus shows up all throughout the Bible in every single book that happens all the way through the book of Revelation. So we've got to do something with that. Like, what's going on here? The Exodus is such a major motif. So let's talk about the story of Exodus, and then I've got 3 points, just like every sermon you've ever heard. 3 points, right? Here we go. So, as you know the story, in the book of Exodus, the Israelites found themselves in slavery in Egypt. For about 400 years, they were under the thumb of Pharaoh, and for at least 10 generations, that was the life that they knew. 10 generations that just knew oppression and hardship until, as the hip-hop group Cross Movement says, the God of the Israelites has got a pain in his heart for the dismal types. And so the Israelites were living a rather dismal experience. And then God took compassion and mercy on that and heard that and said, we got to change this. Now, that story in and of itself might not seem completely revolutionary, but it was. Because in the Egyptian frame of mind, they would say, the gods established slavery. And so the Egyptians would say, our theology says you're supposed to be on the bottom. And then along comes Yahweh, who says, oh no, I don't like this arrangement. I do not approve of this. And so what you had was two competing theologies, the Egyptian one and the Israelite one. One that said that many gods have instituted slavery and this hierarchy that has Pharaoh on top. And then the Israelite one that says, nope, something can be different. The future can be different. All right. What we have in that story is the realization that God is for those on the bottom, not just for those who are on the top of a culture. That's a groundbreaking idea. I'm not sure if we realize that because we have the book of Exodus. We know that story. So to us, it feels normal. But in the original day, what do you think Pharaoh heard when all of a sudden Moses came to him and said, God doesn't like this arrangement? Pharaoh must have had oh my gosh, he was absolutely being challenged to change more than 5% of the way he was thinking about things. And so we've got to ask ourselves in multiple ways. And this is why I said at the beginning of this, forget everything you thought you knew about Christianity. Just try to be as Rene Descartes says, a tabula rasa. Just be a blank slate just for a moment, okay? Just for a moment. We've always got to ask whether or not our theologies are more Egyptian or Israelite. We could say Christian there too. Because we've got 3 things that we've always got to do. All of us have got to stop and ask ourselves whether or not the way we think about God, the way we think about our relationship to God, is based on freedom or not. And freedom is, this weekend is the weekend of freedom. This is what we celebrate on 4th of July weekend, am I right? Now, here's the 3 points, and we're going to break them down. If your theology and the way you think about God doesn't keep God free for people, it's trash. And if your theology doesn't keep people free for God, it's trash. And if your theology doesn't keep people free for people, it's also trash. And so that right there should be a really good rubric to ask ourselves, like, wait, how is it that I think about God? How is it that I think about this relationship? What does Jesus exemplify about the Moses and the Exodus narrative for us? Now, most of us have this idea that freedom is essentially this. It's all about freedom from something. And that is a form of freedom, that's true, but that's not the form of freedom that actually happens in the book of Exodus. Yes, God wanted the Israelites to be free from slavery, but it was more than that. It was actually a freedom for something. Because God also said, you Israelites are supposed to be a blessing to all the rest of the nations of the world. You're being made free from in order to be free for. And that's why I said we've always got to ask ourselves, does our theology and the way we think about God keep God free for people? Does our way of talking about God keep people free for God and keep people free for each other? That's a great question, right? So that first one, we've got to always make sure that we are talking about God in such a way that God is free for people, which means God doesn't show any favoritism. We can't give in to a theology that says God is free only for the rich, only for the elite, only for those who are on top of the culture that already have their life full of blessings. Our theology has got to be one that keeps God free for the people that are being victimized, oppressed, in slavery. Just like the Israelites, God was free for them. And that was groundbreaking back then, and guess what? It's still groundbreaking today to think that God is for those on the underside of a culture today, just like in the book of Exodus. The second one, though, we've got to always ask, are we having a talk about God? And in all of our conversations with people, even outside the church, are we talking about God in such a way that we keep people free for God? I have a very quick story for you. I once heard a pastor talk out loud in front of a room of people about how there was a woman that came to him that was deeply grieved in her sin, whatever it was. I was like, okay. And then he said this very strange phrase that haunted me since. He said, I sat with her and I waited until she just started weeping, and she was sufficiently regretful. And then he said, when I realized that she was sufficiently regretful, then I forgave her sins. I was like, what is this about? As if this pastor has the ability to know when somebody is sufficiently regretful. The grace of God is supposed to be overflowing even before we are actually fully realizing of the hurt that we've caused other people. So I really have trouble shaking that story off. But you know what happened in that story? The woman wasn't free for God until she did whatever fit this pastor's agenda. And that's terrible. To me, that actually says that that pastor had a terrible theology because his theology kept her not free for God until she did That's what we would call conditional grace, not unconditional. And lastly, we've always got to make sure that our theology, the deepest way that we look at reality, keeps people free for people. Do we have a worldview that says who we can and cannot care about? Because if you've got a worldview or a theology or a way of talking about God that lets you or that lets me say, oh, that group of people over there, I don't have to have compassion on them. I don't need to care about them. They're not a part of my tribe, my family, my state, my country. They're not a part of my world. They don't have the same problems as I do. Whoever said that compassion should be limited? And so we've got to ask that same question. And I've had recent conversations with people the past couple weeks, and they've been really quite brilliant, these conversations. Some of these comments that I hear, sometimes I get them in emails. And one of them said, why should I care about social justice? Why should I care about those who have said, according to their life, that they've been victimized by a culture or by something else? Why should I really care about them? And the response I gave was, are you really just asking the question, who is my neighbor? Because that sounds like the story of the Good Samaritan, where two people walk on the opposite side of the road of the man that was beat up and on the side, until the Samaritan, who was like a religious and racial half-breed, came along and showed compassion. The first two people were essentially lawyers and theologians who the laws of their day and their religion kept them from showing compassion. And that's why I bring it up at the beginning of this. Clean slate, tabula rasa this for a moment. Yes or no, do you have a theology that keeps God free for people, people free for God, and people free for each other? I'm going to close with this last thing. Karl Barth, towards the end of his life, was asked, how do you feel about the idea that so many people want to consider themselves Barthian? And that just means that they really liked his writings. He was a Presbyterian pastor in Switzerland during World War II. And he said he was horrified. This man, towards the end of his life, his whole intellectual legacy, he said that he would be horrified if people considered themselves Barthian. And then he said this: the only theology that matters, the only theology that someone should have, especially if they believe in Jesus Christ, would be a theology of freedom. Not a theology of Barth, not a theology of Calvin, not a theology of Luther or Augustine or Aquinas, but just a theology of freedom. That, in my words, I would say, keeps God free for people, keeps people free for God, and keeps people free for each other. God is free at all times for you. And God wants you to always be free for him. And God always wants you to be free for people that don't look like you, talk like you, have the same problems as you. The only theology that matters is a theology of freedom. Happy 4th of July weekend. Happy Independence Day. And may you and I always be willing to change our mind at least 2 to 5% every day and ask ourselves whether or not we are really free for other people, because that's what love is, right? Grace and peace. Thank you. Be well. Goodbye. No, not goodbye. We'll catch you later.